Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today at Statistics Solutions. My name is Justin D'Souza. I'm a quantitative specialist here at the company. During today's webinar, we are going to look at the results chapter and specifically quantitative results. We'll look at how to present things, what are the order of the different section headings to use, and what is the most efficient way to present the results. My colleague Sierra is putting some hyperlinks in the chat box for scheduling consultations and checking out our free dissertation resources on our company website. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. And at the end of the session, we will be doing a Q&A session for everyone. So you can type your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will answer them towards the end. All right, let's go ahead and dive in, and we'll send everyone a copy of the PowerPoint as well as a copy of the webinar. All right, first I'll give a brief overview of the services that we provide at Statistics Solutions. Then we'll look at presenting the quantitative results chapter. We'll review a couple examples so you can see a standard approved results chapter and the order of the information presented, and then we'll conclude with a summary. On this slide, you can see all the various parts of the dissertation that we assist with, starting with topic development and going all the way through final defense preparation. So we have quantitative and qualitative methodologists at our company, and we have literature review specialists. So no matter where you are in the process, we can provide assistance. If you need help framing your purpose and problem statement, finding literature to support your topic, pinpointing a theoretical framework, and then going into the methodology, figuring out your research design, your population and sample size requirements, finding survey instruments to support your study, and figuring out what is the best statistical analysis to address research questions. We can help with all of these various parts of the methodology, but we also assist with the results chapter. So once you've collected your results, you've completed your data collection, we can help crunch the numbers for you and present an APA write-up. And then we also assist with the discussion chapter, PowerPoints for both proposal and final defenses, and journal publications. If you have any questions, you can give us a call at this number below, 727-442-4290, or you can use the links that Sierra provided in the chat box. All right, so we are looking at the results chapter today. What is the purpose of the result? So this is assuming you've completed your data collection, you have IRB approval, and you're ready to report the statistical findings. So the purpose is to present the findings of your data analyses, research question by research question. You want to follow the data analysis plan that you laid out in your methodology chapter. So almost every methodology will have a data analysis plan section where you discuss how are you going to clean your data, what statistics are you going to report, did you collect demographics, what is the primary inferential analysis you're going to use, whether that's correlations, regressions, t-tests, ANOVAs. And you want to present the findings for each research question and hypothesis, and you need to have a clear statement that addresses that research question. Was the null hypothesis rejected, or do we fail to reject the null hypothesis? You want to follow these specific guidelines and requirements from your school. Every school has a different template for the results chapter. So the section headings may be a little bit different. Some schools may require different information compared to others. You may want to also reach out to your chair or your methodologist and see if they have an example that they can provide for you. That way you can kind of mirror a previous example that's been approved. I think that's the best way to go about it. Say, yeah, you can follow your school's template, but the best way is going to be having an example that you can follow. Okay, so this is a general template for a results chapter. Not every school will follow this exact template, but almost every school will contain this information in the chapter. Okay, so you start out with your introduction, then you go into a summary of your data collection and preparation of the data. Then you discuss any demographics that you may have collected. Not every study has demographics, but if you do have a survey questionnaire where you collected gender, age, ethnicity, that sort of thing, you want to report those statistics. Then you give descriptive statistics on your key variables of interest. And then you go into assumption checking, checking things like normality and multicollinearity and linearity. And then you go research question by research question. What are the findings of the analyses for each research question and hypothesis? And then you conclude with a summary. So let's dive into each of these sections a little bit more. Then the introduction chapter or the introduction section, you want to restate the purpose of your study. So verbatim from your earlier chapters, chapter 1, 2, and 3, you should have a purpose statement established by this point. So just copy and paste it. That should be the first statement in your chapter. Then you want to restate your research questions and the hypotheses. And then you want to outline the contents of the results chapter. What is going to be presented? Again, demographics, descriptive statistics, checking for reliability, and then presenting the primary test, if it's ANOVAs, t-tests, correlations, whatever it is. So I have an example here of the introduction. Okay, so right here, let me make this one page. So you have your purpose statement. And then in this chapter, the findings of the data analyses will be presented. And then we go into what will be presented specifically. So frequencies and percentages for demographics, means and standard deviations for continuous data, Cronbach alpha to check for reliability, restate the research question and the hypothesis. What is the primary analysis that's going to be used? In this case, it was an ANOVA. And what is the level of significance that we are going to use? In this case, it is 0.05. So we need p-values to be below 0.05 to identify a significant relationship. All right, so that's the introduction. Then you go into data collection and preparation. So this is where you want to summarize your data collection procedures. Where did you gather the data? What was the time frame in which you gathered the data? Discuss any response rate or attrition numbers you have. So how many people responded to the survey? How many participants did not complete the survey or did not meet the inclusion criteria, or maybe did not provide consent? What was your final sample size for the research? And then give a comparison to your sample size target. So in your methodology chapter, you probably had to do a power analysis, or you used a sample size calculator to figure out the minimum sample size for the research. So compare your final sample size to that minimum target. And also, if you made any adjustments to your original data collection plan, you'll want to discuss those up here. So maybe you plan to do data collection on your own and administer the survey to your own sample, but then midway through, you didn't gather enough participants, so you have to employ SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics to target participants for you. So if that plan was not laid out in your methodology, you want to discuss that change in the results chapter. Okay, so here we have an example data collection process. So here you give a time frame. We discussed the software that was used. So Qualtrics was the data collection platform, and the data were then entered into SPSS for analysis. Give a total sample size for participants who were invited, and then identify how many cases were removed, either through not providing consent, not meeting the inclusion criteria, or not completing a majority of the questionnaire. And then discussing potential outliers. So if you had any extremely high or low values, you may want to remove those cases and then provide the final sample size for the research and compare that number to the power analysis or sample size calculation that was conducted in chapter 3 or your methodology. So in this case, the final was 108, which exceeds the minimum that we calculated, 96. Okay, so there are many ways to handle missing data. We've done webinars on these in the past. You can replace the missing values through imputation. You can replace through mean substitution. This is the process that this participant laid out in their methodology. Is if they did not respond to a majority of the questionnaire, then the participants would be removed altogether. So you'll have to check with your methodologist and your committee and see if they have a preference for how to deal with missing data. So that's the data collection process. Then we go into the demographics and descriptive statistics. So this is where you summarize your demographic variables and your variables of interest for your research questions. So provide frequencies and percentages for any categorical factors, gender, ethnicity, education level, and provide means and standard deviations for any numeric variables, continuous variables. So things like age and years or GPA, or if you're using a Likert scale survey and you're building a composite score, then you want to use means and standard deviations to summarize the responses. And if you're able to, compare your demographics to the greater population. That's not something I see very often, but sometimes that is a part of the template for a results chapter, is you want to compare the proportions of gender, ethnicity, education to the population numbers that you are sampling from. And then the last part of the descriptive statistics is usually presenting a reliability measurement. The most prevalent case for this would be a Cronbach alpha value. Okay, so let's take a look at an example here for this. Okay, so here we have our descriptive statistics section, and you want to have a table that summarizes all the demographics, so gender, race, education level, and so forth. We have the variable and the categories here, and then we have the frequency under this column, and we have the respective percentage. Okay, so you have 86 females. Those 86 females represent 78.9% of the sample. And then in the narrative preceding this, you want to summarize the trends of the demographics. Usually you talk about the most prevalent category, or if there's anything unexpected in the demographics. So if there's a statistic that you did not anticipate, you want to discuss that in this section here. And then the second part of the descriptives will be presenting a Cronbach alpha value, potentially. So this only applies if you're using a self-report Likert scale survey. Cronbach alpha, we have a threshold with the citation here. So ideally, Cronbach alpha needs to be above 0.7, which it is in this case. So in this table, we have the name of the variable, we have the number of items within that scale, and we have the Cronbach alpha value right here. So Cronbach alpha was 0.762, which is above a 0.7, which universally that's considered acceptable reliability. And then the third part of descriptive statistics is presenting the descriptives for your variables of interest. Okay, so in this case, attitude toward inclusion, which was a Likert scale based survey. You give the sample size, you give the minimum value for the whole sample, you give the maximum value, you give the mean or the average, that is probably the most important value here, and then you give the standard deviation with representation of the spread. So the mean, compare the mean to previously validated thresholds or compare it to the Likert scale. And you can make an overall determination on whether the perceptions were positive, were they neutral, or were they negative. Okay, so those are the descriptives. Then you can go into assumption checking. So every statistical analysis, most parametric analyses, I should say, have assumptions that you should check before you run your primary analysis. So things like normality, homogeneity, and variance. So you want to discuss how was each assumption tested? What was the result of that assumption test? Was the assumption supported or not supported? And what action did you take if the assumption was not supported? So this can be done in a couple different ways. It depends on your template for your school. Sometimes there's a dedicated section, report assumptions, before you present your research questions. Other times I've seen the assumptions presented underneath each research. I can show you both of those examples here. In this example, we have a dedicated assumption section. So here, assumptions of an ANOVA is presented before the research question. And this is useful if you're using variables multiple times. If you're checking for normality on a variable, but you're using that variable multiple times throughout the chapter, then you want to have a dedicated assumption section. Otherwise, it will be redundant to present normality for each research question for the same variable. So you can have one section at the top like this. So for an ANOVA, the primary assumptions were normality and homogeneity of variance. And we discuss what is the test being used to check for normality. In this case, it's a Shapiro-Wilk test. We give a brief definition of what a Shapiro-Wilk test is. And then we present the results. So in this case, we had a significant result on the Shapiro-Wilk test, which is actually not ideal. We discussed this last week. If you joined for the correlation webinar, we talked about Shapiro-Wilk a little bit more. So significance means that the assumption is not supported in this case. So then you can provide a justification. So in this case, if the sample size is sufficiently large, you can still proceed with the analysis because this is using the central limit theorem, in that the larger your sample size is, the more it tends to approximate towards normality. And then we have our second assumption, which is homogeneity of variance, which in this case was tested with a Levene's test. We give a definition of Levene's test and what were the results. So in this case, the assumption was supported because we had a non-significant result. So this was a dedicated assumption section. Here's one where we do not have a dedicated assumption section. We have the research question. We kind of give an introduction to the research question. What are the analyses we're using? In this case, a linear regression. We have a definition of a linear regression. We identify the independent and dependent variables, and then we go into assumption checking. And so in this case, for a linear regression, you should check for normality with a PP scatter plot or a QQ scatter plot. And we can see that the data closely followed this diagonal trend line, which means normality was supported. And then the second assumption is homoscedasticity, which is presented in this scatter plot. And we want random scatter, random spread, showing independence of the observations, which we do see here. So that assumption was supported. So you can do it either way. You can have a dedicated assumption section, or you can present it within the research questions. Again, check with your school's template. Okay, and then you present the results of your analyses. Okay, so this is the analysis of the research questions. It's done after checking assumptions. And you want to organize this section by research question and hypothesis. and you'll want to note if there are any changes from your original plan. So perhaps you proposed to do a Pearson correlation, but the assumptions were not supported. So you need to run a Spearman correlation instead. Then you want to clearly identify what are the independent, dependent, predictor, criterion, covariates in your study. Then you want to report your key statistics for each test. What is the t-test value? What is the f-test value? What are the p-values and effect sizes, potentially confidence intervals, or any post-hoc testing that applies to your study. And the most important takeaway is you need to have a clear statement that addresses the hypotheses. So usually you connect your findings back to the null hypothesis, and you'll want to say, was the null hypothesis rejected, or was the null hypothesis, do we fail to reject null hypothesis? If you don't have a null hypothesis, maybe you just have a research hypothesis, then it's going to be the opposite of this. You either support your research hypothesis, or we do not have evidence to support your research hypothesis. Okay, so going back to the first example, the one with an ANOVA, we have our research question and hypothesis presented here. We specify what is the ANOVA conducted for. We give a definition of an ANOVA here, which may not be necessary. You might have that in your methodology already. Then you give a definition of your independent variables and your dependent variable, and then you present the findings of the ANOVA. So for an ANOVA, you need a couple tables per APA format. First, you give a row with the independent variable. You have your f-test with the degrees of freedom here. You have your f-statistic. You have your p-value, which is the most important value here. And you have an effect size, which may not be necessary. That also depends on your school's template. But the p-value is the big takeaway here. So in this case, the p-value was greater than 0.05, meaning that we do not have significant differences in attitude toward inclusion by position, which is our independent variable. So that is what we summarize up here. So the overall findings were not significant, indicating that we did not have significant differences. And because we did not find significant differences, we cannot reject the null hypothesis. So going back up here, the null hypothesis usually states that there's not a significant difference or a significant relationship between the variables. So we cannot reject the statement because we did not find a significant difference. Okay. And then you can also present descriptive statistics of the groups. So this is really what the ANOVA is testing. Is there a difference in attitude toward inclusion, which is presented in these mean scores here based on the position of educators? We can see, there wasn't a significant difference identified, but just eyeballing the means, they're fairly similar. So you could have some talking points here. You could say that administrators had the lowest attitude toward inclusion score. General education and special education had the highest, with both of them having a 3.93. And then you can also present any bar charts or histograms or pie charts to visualize the data. Okay, and I have a second example here. This is for a linear regression. We looked at this briefly when I was discussing assumptions. So again, you give a description of what analysis is being conducted, give a definition of the analysis, what is the independent variable, and what is the dependent variable. And then in this example, assumptions were checked next. We'll scroll down through here. And then we have the findings of the linear regression model. So it's basically summarizing what's in this table here. This is an APA format to report a linear regression. So we summarize those findings here, and we conclude with a definitive statement that Because there was a significant relationship, the p-values below 0.05, we can reject the null hypothesis in this example. Okay, and then we have the scatter plot at the very bottom to depict the relationship in the regression. And you can also have, if after you do your research questions, you might have additional analyses that you want to present. You can either call those ancillary analyses, or you could consider it a post hoc analysis. So if these are any additional analyses that are not connected to your research questions, you can present those at the bottom. Come to an agreement with your committee on what ancillary analyses to conduct. You don't want to present too many, because the more you present, the more there is for your committee to critique and give feedback on. You want the focus to be on the research questions. Okay, and then you conclude with a summary after you present your findings. So summarize the contents of the chapter. What were the findings of the research questions? And give a definitive statement. Did you reject or fail to reject the hypothesis? And then provide a transition statement to your discussion. Okay, so we have that here. Again, just copy and paste your purpose statement. And oftentimes at this part of the paper, I would see this shifted to past tense. So the purpose of this study was, because it's now been conducted. And then what was presented in this chapter? What were the overall findings of the ANOVA? Was the null hypothesis rejected or not rejected? And then give a preview to the next chapter. So in the next chapter, that's usually when you connect your findings back to the literature, and you can discuss limitations and recommendations for future studies. Okay. And that pretty much covers it. So if we have any questions, you can type them into the chat box or the Q&A box. And we'll send everyone a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint. Excellent. Thanks for joining, Janie and Roman. Good to see some familiar names. Have any questions about presenting results, or do you need any guidance on what analyses to run? Thanks, Cecilia. Have any questions, or is there a section you'd like me to review again? Thanks, Edmond. Thanks for joining us. And we can see what is on the horizon for our webinars here. I will be doing another one on Thursday. I believe that is about doing test differences. Okay, so it looks like tomorrow we're doing a surviving your dissertation webinar, and then on Thursday I will be doing how to conduct and interpret tested differences, which we looked at briefly today. So things like ANOVAs, MANOVAs, t-tests, look at those more in depth. Okay, so come join us again if you have any questions, and we'll send everyone a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint. Have a great day. Take care.